Well, thank you for sticking around to the end of today's project, and it's thrilling to hear what you're doing here at the school. And I've got ideas about ways we can work together in the future on this project, because this project is essentially about interpreting history to the public. And I should begin by saying I'm not a historian by training. I'm a clinical psychologist. What am I doing in history? Well, 2 years ago when I retired from my work, they reburied the Massasoit Osamequin behind my house at Burrs Hill and Warren. So I got curious about the whole thing, and one thing led to another, and what this is leading to now is establishing a National Heritage Area here. These areas, how many have heard of a National Heritage Area? Good. Oh, all right.
Through you.
Yeah, okay. I had no idea where these existed except for the Blackstone Valley Heritage Area Corridor, which is now a national park. But this is a program under the National Park Service that permits groupings of small historical locations throughout the country to interpret history on a particular theme. So, there are now 54 of these areas around the country. Okay? You may not be familiar with every one of them, and often what happens is you happen to be driving through an area, you'll see one location, and then begin to learn about all the other locations there. These aren't places that have Niagara Falls or Grand Canyon. These are places that have a lot of little places along the way. In New England, there's 6 of these. Anybody hear of all 6 of these? I had no idea. Again, Blackstone Heritage Corridor, but Housatonic and Western Mass and Connecticut along the border there. Freedom's Way up and crosses the Massachusetts-New Hampshire border. Last Green Valley, just over the Connecticut border. You know about that one?
I live in it.
All right. That's one way to find out about it, right? Essex, which I'm familiar with, spending a lot of time up in Ipswich and looking at 17th century structures up there. But that goes also into New Hampshire. And Champlain Valley, which borders both sides of the lake, both in New York and Vermont. So those are our areas. I want to add number 7. Because just like this is the Blackstone Heritage Corridor, which begins basically down here at Slater Mill, but now goes all the way up to Worcester, okay, and encompasses dozens of locations along that trail. And again, if you find one or get on their website, you begin to find all the others. This was put together as one of the first National Heritage Areas back in the early 90s. Since that time, the Museum of Work and Culture was constructed. So it shows you what happens when you bring attention to an area, that you get support for designing other ways of interpreting history. I'll go over this real quickly. There are impact studies if you want to look at those, but basically what those show is literally billions of dollars in economic revenue generated. This is across the country with all 54 sites. But that's the way you get Congress behind designating a new area, is to say, for a small investment, only $300,000 a year, what federal program do you know of that's only $300,000 a year? You then create synergy that brings attention to those locations, and the businesses love it. So, why not here in Soames? If you have not heard the word Soames before, it was the native description of this southern area, and you can see on the map, really extending all the way up to Providence, but the Narragansett Bay area, and obviously with Bristol down at the bottom there, for King Philip, that was where he resided, and the Massasoit Osamequin up in either Warren or Barrington, Tyler Point. opinions vary, but clearly this was the area. And if you just look at that, you understand why people wanted to live here for thousands of years, because of the access to water, for not only for food, but also transportation. This was the original home of the Pokanokets. You will usually hear the word Wampanoag, right? Well, that word didn't appear in the literature till 1702, and every map prior to that will say Pokanoket, because that was the tribe who was here, and it was the leader of the tribe, the Massasoit Osamequin. He was one of many Massasoits who resided in Warren or Barrington much of his time, not all of his time. He led over 60 tribes that went all the way up to the Charles River in Boston, all the way over to Nutaconacut Hill in Providence, and all the way down to the islands. But notice, not the Cape, because the Cape was Mashpee, and a tribe that allied with the English against the Pokanokets during the King Philip War. Very interesting history that needs a lot better interpretation these days. These are folks who've lived here for at least 10,000 years, ever since the glaciers receded 12,000 years ago. They were the first human people to occupy this area and did so quite successfully until some of the traders brought with them more than trinkets and knives and beads from England. They also brought some of the vilest of diseases, and between 1616 and 1619 wiped out 90% of the population along the coast. Okay, it was like a nuclear bomb went off there, destroying these communities, destroying their history, destroying their shared technology, and everything that made them a strong tribe at that time. Now gone, and who should arrive just in time, because God had cleared the way, but our friends from Leiden, coming over from Leiden and from England. Well, they needed to form an alliance because, quite frankly, both groups were in trouble. The English were in trouble because half of them died during that first winter, and had they not gotten help, probably either the rest of them would have died, or maybe they would have convinced the captain to take him back with him when he went back to England, and that would have been it. Okay, we might be speaking French or Algonquin or whatever at that point, but the Massasoit, because he was fearful, having lost his warriors, that the Narragansetts, who had already occupied what is now Providence, might decide that this is a wonderful place for them as well, and like many tribes and in that time, you would take over another tribe and incorporate them. Well, his chance was to form a treaty with Governor Carver and of mutual protection that would allow both of them to survive, and for a sharing of their technology. That treaty is celebrated on the back of the Sacagawea dollar coin. Nobody ever looks at the back. But that's the only acknowledgement that I can find in the federal government ever gave to that treaty, the so-called Wampanoag Treaty. Of course, if you talk to the Pokanoket tribe, they'll say it should have said Pokanoket. There wasn't any Wampanoag then. Ed Winslow, who was essentially serving as the Secretary of State, their external guy, decided that after this treaty, he would come down and visit the Massasoit and Soames, and that's what he did. We don't know exactly where, but somewhere within 4 or 5 miles of here. Though Virginia Baker would argue that it must have been at the spring, there's no certain evidence that that's where the Massasoit was living. In fact, when Winslow came back a couple of years later, the Massasoit was ill and a Dutch trading ship had just left. So the chances are pretty good that it was along the river in any case. All we have are circumstantial bits of evidence, but we can weave the story together of how Winslow, and this is very well described in the English literature that he wrote in Mort's Relation, in Good News from New England, describing his, if you will, his curing of the Massasoit, which then solidified their friendship for life until Winslow's death in the 50s and Osamequin's death around 1660-61. Another one of the pilgrims was very interested in this area, Miles Standish, their military leader. He bought land down here. Why? Because this Soames, the southern area, was cleared land. In fact, Pokanoket often translates as the cleared land. The native people would burn off the land twice a year, spring and fall, and kept it open for hunting and traveling. Okay. But when the English, like Miles, saw this land, he said, "This is perfect. This is just like England, isn't it?" That had been denuded of all the trees at that point. But here was open land for planting and livestock. So they brought their animals and began the process of taking over the land. A visitor to this area in 1636, our friend Roger, who visited Soames on his way to what's now East Providence. We have reasonable evidence from one little fragment of one sentence that he was taken care of by Osamequin's tribe members because he had met Osamequin when he first came to Plymouth and spent a year there before he then removed to Salem and then was removed from Salem and walked the 60 miles down here in one of the worst winters that ever occurred at that time. The entire Narragansett Bay was frozen solid, so you know it was cold then. This is what we think, or what the Williams family thinks, is the place that sheltered Roger Williams. This is just over the Swansea-Warren line. If you go up Birch Swamp Road, turn right and go into the woods, it's on private property, but Charlie McCoy, the physician who owns it, is happy to have us lead tours there. But we also think from just looking at the place and examining it that it was likely a winter encampment, that they didn't stick Roger out in the woods and leave him by himself, that he was joined and taken care of by Margaret, whoever she might have been, from the tribe, long enough for him to spend 14 weeks in recovery, and then was given land by Osamequin up on the Omega Pond in what's now East Providence, an area that begs for better interpretation because that sign that you see way at the back of the property, nobody can ever, you can't see it from the road. Okay.
That's part of our field trip as freshmen. Like
Oh,
they go
good.
there. They just the last time we were there this past spring, someone was cleaning it up and they just got a grant to spruce
Yep.
up the area. So I don't know what's going on.
It looks a little better now, but
Yeah.
I'm working with the town and we're going to put an interpretive sign right at the curb.
Good.
That'll tell the whole story. The problem with both bronze and granite plaques is you just can't put a photo on there. You can't really tell a story in a paragraph that anybody can understand. So you obviously know that he got kicked out of there. Plymouth didn't want him there, so off he went, what's your knee top, and canoed around and what have you. And I don't need to explain what's going on downtown there. You all know that very well. Not long after that, a group from Weymouth, Reverend Newman, brought his folks down and established the first real English settlement in this part of the land here outside of Plymouth, and built the Ring of the Green, and you can go up there and now see some of the people who were living at the time who were buried there, particularly if your name was Carpenter. Not too long after that, well actually there's a whole story that I'm not going to tell in terms of what led up to the war, but we know by the time of 1675 that the native population, which had been reduced, we think, roughly, I mean, there are many different estimates, nobody had a census, but one way of thinking of it is there were about 70,000 native people here when 1620. By the time of the war, there were only about 7,000. They had been literally decimated, okay, largely due to more disease and just the stress of occupation. And then by the outbreak of the war, 700 remaining here on the peninsula, because these English settlements, which went all the way down to Newport and Portsmouth and up and around, were literally surrounding Philip. So even though he tried to keep to his father's original agreement, you have to remember that the Mass Bay colony now was having a much greater influence over things, and they never had a treaty. Okay, so though Plymouth was still involved, you had changes in how that mutual protection was interpreted at that point. And the war broke out. You say at Miles Garrison, I say on Child Street in Warren, on there's Joe Winslow's farm there. Okay, and then quickly the militia came down from Boston and started at Miles Garrison, marched down Metacom here, okay, looking to find Philip over here at Mount Hope. Of course, he knew all about their arrival, and the entire village had left, okay, leaving church very frustrated. But eventually he managed to work his way across the Taunton River and back up and all the way up to Brookfield. And again, I'm not going to go into the whole story of the war, but if you look at what was going on, my interpretation is that they were simply trying to get the English to leave, to get them back to England. And many of them did go. Others went down to Newport, which at the time was Narragansett territory, and burned 25 villages, killed 2,500 English people. But in the end, they were the losers, because not only was Philip shot here at Mount Hope Farm in the Myery Swamp, but those remaining native people were either shot on sight, okay, or pushed out of the area and often went to New York and joined other tribes, or were enslaved and sent to Barbados. So if you were Pokanoket, you couldn't speak the language, you couldn't say you're Pokanoket. That's why that name disappeared. There was a concerted effort to remove Pokanoket from this area, and then it got replaced with this more generic term of Wampanoag. You can find the final battle up in Rehoboth of Anawan Rock, where Church met Anawan and defeated him, but spent the night sharing war stories. I love that. There's two generals. Oh yeah, I did this, I did that, and then of course he goes. They send him up to Plymouth, and hung him or shot him. I can't remember.
They executed.
Yeah. Well, here's the monument to the Massasoits, reburied down at Burrs Hill Park. And you say, why reburied? Well, he was buried here. He was actually died in Brookfield, brought down by the tribe and buried in a royal burial ground, which was right across from the town beach in Warren. If you haven't been there, you should go there. You will see what many people describe as mounds there. Those are not Indian burial mounds. Those are the remains of sand dunes. There was a 30-foot high sand dune where the parking lot is now that got taken down in 1921 to build a park. 1913, Charles Carr, the librarian for the town, amateur archaeologist, got permission from the railroad company. This is the same railroad company that built the East Bay bike path, okay? They gave him permission to exhume 42 graves there. So Gibson does a great job of describing all those items that were taken from those graves. It was those items that the Mashpees, because they were federally recognized in 2007, had the opportunity then to go to the museums where all that stuff was and reclaim it. And then finally, 2 years ago, May of 2017, reburied it in concrete vault underneath the park and that monument. So the Massasoit is there. We're pretty sure because Virginia Baker describes some of the red horseman's coat that he was wearing that they found in one of the graves there. So that's the history. The question is now, how do we get people to know the Pokanokets again? Okay, and I've been working with them for the last couple of years. They're very much alive and well, and we got a small grant that did some educational programs in the schools around here. We're going to start next year, probably on July 5th in Burrs Hill Park. Okay, Soames Heritage Day, and it's going to be the first year. It will be nothing but the tribe interpreting their own history, and then the following year we're going to bring the English in because that's after Plymouth, and then 2 years after that, in 2023, we're going to reenact Winslow's visit. And I'm looking for people who are willing to walk from Plymouth down here. I don't know how that's going to go. So here we are. We're not Plymouth, but besides all of that history, 17th century history, we're also the home of the oldest 4th of July parade, location of shipbuilding and slave trading in Warren and Bristol. We have Blythewold, Coggeshall Farm, historic mills and other locations. And next year we expect 7 million visitors to Plymouth, okay? But nobody knows about what went on here. So we have to interpret that history for them, and we have to create the mechanisms to do that. And these are the steps. We've educated the public. I'm working with business leaders to learn the economic advantages of bringing history to life here. History is our most important product around here. That's what we have. Okay. Create a 501, get support from political leaders, write legislation, submit it for federal funding. My goal is by 2027, and hire some staff and open the Soames Heritage area here. That's the plan. Anybody wants to work with me on it, let me know. There we go. So, that's how to interpret 17th century history around here. As my cohort who started this project, Helen Chater, says, what a Soames is a story still in the making of those who have gone before us, of our generation and of generations to come. And the painting is by Martin Heath, 1858 view, and that's us sitting over there on that land. That's Mount Hope, okay? And that's the Roger Williams campus 150 years ahead of time. So that's my story, and I'm sticking with it. Okay.
Thank you, Dave.